On a quiet blue ocean in early June 1942, 4 floating cities of steel were about to meet their fate in the span of a few minutes. The ships were Japanese: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the razor edge of the force that had shocked the world at Pearl Harbor. By sunset, 3 would be burning. By dawn, all 4 would be gone. The question that drives our story is simple and sharp. How did the United States flip the Pacific War so fast, and why didn't Japan see it coming? Tonight we start at the edge of the map, where a tiny atoll called Midway became a trap, and the men who set it were not sailors at all, but code breakers in a basement. Pearl Harbor lay 6 months in the past. In that half year, Japan looked unstoppable. Their navy had reached from China to Southeast Asia, swept across island chains, and hammered Allied bases. In April, American bombers carried out a daring raid on Tokyo, not because it was militarily decisive, but because it proved something. Japan was not untouchable. That shock to Tokyo, combined with Japan's hunger to finish off the U.S. carrier force, pushed Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto toward a bold idea. He would dangle a lure, Midway, a coral ring in the middle of nowhere, and crush the American carriers when they rushed to save it. On paper, it was elegant. In reality, it was a plan with cracks that would split open under pressure. Here is the heart of the counterplan, and it begins in silence. In a windowless room at Pearl Harbor, American cryptanalysts worked on fragments of the Japanese naval code. They could not read every word, but they could read enough. A target labeled AF kept appearing in messages. The analysts suspected AF was Midway. To confirm it, they set a trap of their own. Midway's garrison sent an unencrypted message into the air, claiming its freshwater system had failed. Soon after, U.S. listening posts heard the Japanese report that AF was short on water. In that moment, the fog lifted. The target was Midway. The date was early June. The Americans would be waiting. Admiral Chester Nimitz moved quietly. He could not meet Japan ship for ship, but he could meet them with timing, surprise, and nerve. He ordered his available carriers, Enterprise and Hornet under Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, and Yorktown under Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, into a position northeast of Midway. The location mattered. From there, American planes could reach the Japanese carriers before those carriers expected any threat. Yorktown had been battered at the Coral Sea and patched in a rush. Welders were still warm when she sailed. But she sailed. Nimitz did not need a perfect fleet. He needed a fleet that arrived on time. Japan's striking arm was led by Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the same commander who had overseen the attack on Pearl Harbor. His force carried 4 heavy carriers, Akagi and Kaga, big and battle-hardened, Soryu and Hiryu, fast and dangerous. 2 other carriers that had fought at Coral Sea, Shokaku and Zuikaku, were absent. One damaged, the other short of trained air crews. That gap would not show itself in the first hour of battle, but it would matter when the day stretched long and every spare squadron counted. Numbers, pilots, and replacement decks. These slow facts decide fast battles. Both sides studied the map, but they saw different oceans. For Yamamoto and Nagumo, Midway was bait for a decisive battle in the old style. The enemy fleet would be drawn out and destroyed in a clean, hard blow. For Nimitz, Midway was a stage. The fight would not be decided by who threw the first punch at an island, but by who found the enemy carriers first and who struck them while they were most exposed. This is the core of carrier warfare, the fleet that scouts better, that puts bombs and torpedoes onto enemy decks at the right minute, wins. Guns and armor still mattered, but scouting and timing mattered more. On June 3rd, the curtain lifted. Long-legged PBY Catalina patrol planes flew wide arcs from Midway, engines droning over empty water until the ocean finally gave up a shape, then a line, then a fleet. Contact reports went out. Positions, headings, speed, every piece of data was a dot on an invisible map being drawn in the minds of admirals and squadron leaders miles apart. That night, one of those Catalinas crept in low over black waves and released a torpedo at a Japanese oiler named Akebono Maru. The explosion was not decisive, but it was proof. The enemy could be found. The enemy could be touched. At dawn on June 4th, Nagumo's carriers launched their first major strike, aimed not at the American carriers he had not yet found, but at Midway itself. Bombers and fighters roared toward the atoll. On the island, Marines, Navy flyers, and Army crews scrambled everything that could fly. Outdated fighters clawed into the air. Dive bombers lifted off one after another, their wings heavy with ordnance. Army B-26s and B-17s set out across long stretches of sea, looking for carriers they might hit in level or glide attacks. The first clash was uneven and brutal. Japanese pilots were seasoned and well coordinated. Midway's defenders paid for their courage in aircraft and lives. So why did those painful early attacks still matter? Because pressure changes choices. Nagumo now knew he had damaged the island, but not destroyed it. His strike leaders asked for a second hit to finish the airfields. At the same time, scouts began to report possible American ships. He had planes in the air that had been loaded for bombs against land targets. He had torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs below decks for ship killing. He could not strike with both at once. He had to decide what his next blow should be and how to arm it. Every minute he paused to think was a minute when enemy carriers could be closing in. Far to the northeast, American task forces knifed through the sea. On Enterprise and Hornet, pilots waited in ready rooms, their map boards marked with estimated positions. Yorktown stood slightly apart. Fletcher held overall tactical command and would have to decide when and how to commit his air wing. Radio discipline stayed tight. There was no grand speech, just routine orders and the quiet ritual of pre-flight checks. Many of the men were young. Some had never seen a battle like this. They knew only that somewhere out there were 4 Japanese carriers, and if those carriers found them first, the day would be short and terrible. Back at Midway, the morning grew hotter. The first Japanese strike group returned, its pilots reporting damage to the island but no knockout. On the carriers, crews worked on deck and in hangars to refuel and rearm the next wave. Below, carts moved bombs, hoses fed gasoline, torpedoes were rolled into position. A carrier is a factory floor when it is most deadly, and a tinderbox when it is most vulnerable. Up above, the combat air patrol of Japanese Zero fighters circled, engines humming, watching for specks on the horizon that might be American attackers. Those specks began to appear, and they kept coming. Midway sent out strike after strike from the atoll itself. Marine Dauntlesses, Army attack planes, Navy torpedo bombers, some in new TBF Avengers, others in older TBD Devastators. Many never returned. They did not sink a carrier in those early passes. But think of what they accomplished that cannot be seen on a map. They forced the Japanese to maneuver, to defend, to keep their fighters low and busy. They created friction. They stole minutes. And minutes, on this day, were everything. Let's step back and look at the 2 chessboards side by side. Nagumo had launched his first punch and hurt the island, but Midway still fought back. He now juggled scouting reports about American surface forces, while his deck crews handled fuel and ordnance for follow-on strikes. His original plan, bomb Midway again, then engage any ships, was being pulled apart by the reports coming in. On the American side, Fletcher and Spruance had the advantage of knowing roughly where and when the enemy would appear, thanks to the codebreakers. They did not need to throw a perfect first strike. They needed to keep the pressure on and land a clean blow when the window opened. As the clock ticked toward mid-morning, that window began to form. American torpedo squadrons would soon fly at wave-top height into walls of fire. Dive bombers would fan out across empty sky, searching for wakes and shadows. A destroyer's decision to sprint after a submarine would leave a trail that could be followed like an arrow. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Mind, a Japanese flag formation to the northwest of Midway, 4 carriers preparing their next move, an American force to the northeast, 3 carriers ready to gamble on speed and surprise, and over the atoll itself, the smell of burned coral and aviation fuel as ground crews rearm what planes they still have. The reason this first act matters is because it shapes every decision that follows. Code breaking did not drop bombs. For now, hold this picture in your eye. It placed the American carriers in the right patch of ocean at the right hour. Midway's defenders did not sink a carrier. They bent the timing of their enemy's day. The PBY's night torpedo run did not cripple Japan's fleet. It proved the line of approach and reminded American crews that the enemy was mortal. Yorktown's rushed repairs did not make her new. They made her present. All of these choices and all of this pressure set the stage for the moment when skill, luck, and nerve would meet. Think also about the people inside these metal stories. On Midway, young Marines rolled bombs under wing roots while the ground shook from near misses. In the Enterprise ready room, pilots traced lines on maps and tried not to think about how long their fuel would last if they failed to find the target on the first try. On Akagi, deck officers barked orders to clear lanes and rearm on the fly, while messages from scouts came in fragments and maybes. None of them knew what we know now, that at around 10:20 a.m., 3 carriers would be aflame. They only knew their next task, and that the next task had to be done fast. By 9:01 a.m., the air above Midway was a crowded, dangerous place. Smoke drifted, wreckage floated on the sea. The Japanese command wrestled with a hard question: hit the island again, or arm for ships? Reported enemy contacts tugged the answer toward ships. But to strike ships, you needed torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs. Switching loads took time, and time was bleeding away. It is tempting to imagine battles as clean chess diagrams. Midway was not. It was a sequence of rushed decisions taken in noise and heat by people who had trained for order and were handed chaos. And yet, in that chaos, patterns form. American torpedo planes would soon arrive low and slow, where every gun on a Japanese carrier could reach them. Their courage would not be measured by hits, because they would not score any in that first wave. It would be measured by what their sacrifice bought: a sky cleared of enemy fighters at the crucial altitude, a set of carriers forced into tight defensive turns, and a handful of minutes in which other attackers could come in from above. That is the hinge upon which the second act turns. But first, the sun has to climb a little higher. The last of Midway's early strikes heads home on fumes. On the Japanese decks, crews curse the heat, shoulder the weight of torpedoes, and fight the clock. On the American decks, engines cough to life, wings unfold, and flight leaders fix the wind on their cheeks. Out past the atoll, a PBY circles, scribbling notes over gray water. Somewhere down there, invisible, a submarine tracks targets she can barely see and prays for a shot that won't come too late. The ocean looks empty, the sky looks calm, and yet, in the next few minutes, 3 giant ships will be turned into burning metal. This is the moment the war tilts. Here is the question that pulls us forward. How do men flying slow, fragile torpedo planes, planes many called outdated, help open the door for a strike that shatters Japan's best carriers? The answer is not about perfect weapons. It is about timing, pressure, and courage that buys minutes. Minutes that change everything. Dawn has passed. The first Japanese strike has hit Midway. Smoke hangs over the atoll, and the defenders are rearming what aircraft they still have. Out at sea, 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, are maneuvering, recovering aircraft, refueling, and making decisions that will shape the day. Northeast of them, 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, Yorktown, are launching their own waves. On paper, the matchup is uneven. In the air, it is worse. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol is full of fast, lethal Zero fighters. The American torpedo planes are slow, unarmored, and must attack straight and low. But war is not a paper plan. It is a series of collisions, of men, machines, and seconds. Torpedo Squadron 8 goes first. VT-8 launches from Hornet and never finds its escorts. They press on anyway. 15 TBD Devastators, old by 1942 standards, fly in at wave-top height. The pilots can see splashes from enemy gunfire walking toward them. They keep going. They spread out to divide the Japanese fire. One by one, they are cut down by Zeros and anti-aircraft guns. Not a single torpedo finds a target. Not a single plane makes it back. The squadron's leader, Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, is killed with most of his men. Ensign George Gay, floating later in the ocean with a seat cushion, will be the only survivor from VT-8 to witness what comes next. Minutes later, Torpedo 6 from Enterprise arrives. VT-6 has trained for this, but training cannot make you faster. The Devastators must fly straight to drop a torpedo. The Japanese carriers turn hard to comb the torpedo paths, and the Zero fighters dive down to low altitude to stop the attack. Again, the result is slaughter. VT-6 does not score a hit. Then Torpedo 3 from Yorktown, VT-3, charges in as well. Same story. Long runs, walls of fire, no hits. If you chart these attacks on a map, the lines look like failure. But that is not the real map. The real map is in the sky above the carriers. Look at the altitude of the Japanese fighters. Look at the direction of their turns. See the chaos on the decks below as crews clear wreckage, refuel planes, and roll bombs and torpedoes to the elevators. The torpedo squadrons have pulled the enemy's fighters down to sea level. They have stretched the formation. They have forced the carriers into constant hard turns. They have stolen time. The cost is terrible. The effect is invisible until it isn't. While those torpedo planes are dying, another drama is playing out miles away and thousands of feet higher. Enterprise's dive bomber group, led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, has been flying a long search over empty ocean. Fuel is running low. The navigation points are estimates, not certainties. If they turn back now, they may not have enough gas to return to the carrier. If they fly on and do not find the enemy, they will be forced to ditch. McCluskey makes a choice that can only be called a gamble, but a trained one. Use the ocean itself as a clue. He spots a single Japanese destroyer, Arashi, sprinting at high speed, cutting a bright wake across the blue. Why the rush? A destroyer does not race like that unless it is trying to catch up with something important. Earlier, Arashi had been chasing an American submarine. Now it is heading back to the fleet. McCluskey lines up on that wake. He holds his course. Minutes tick away. Then the horizon changes. Tiny dots become shapes. Shapes become carriers. The enemy is right there, exactly where he needed them to be. Only minutes before the window would have closed. Radio discipline breaks. Enterprise dive bombers fan out. McCluskey signals the attack. The first group swings toward Kaga. Another group is meant to hit Akagi, but in the rush and confusion of the dive, many pilots fix on the larger ship in their sights. Almost the entire first wave drops on Kaga. Bombs punch through the decks and explode in the hangars below. Fires leap up, fed by fuel and munitions. Kaga is turned into a furnace in seconds. That sudden overload on Kaga leaves a gap and a chance. A small three-plane section led by Lieutenant Dick Best finds Akagi unmolested. They dive steeply. Best releases at a dangerously low altitude to be sure. A single bomb slams near the amidships elevator, detonating among fueled and armed aircraft. Fire roars along the hangar. In moments, Akagi's nerve center begins to fail. The flagship is mortally wounded. Almost at the same time, Yorktown's dive bombers, VB-3 under Lieutenant Commander Max Leslie, arrive from a different approach. They fall on Soryu. Hits ripple across her deck and into the hangars. Explosions stack, one after another. In the space of roughly 5 minutes around 10:20 a.m., 3 of Japan's 4 carriers are in flames. What the torpedo squadrons bought with blood, the clearing of the low sky, the forcing of the carriers into tight, predictable turns, has been cashed in by the dive bombers at precisely the right minute. Why was the timing so catastrophic for Japan? Because carriers are most vulnerable when they are doing the very work that makes them deadly. To launch a strike, you need fueled aircraft, armed with bombs or torpedoes, staged in hangars and on decks, with crews moving metal and gasoline through narrow spaces. When bombs crash through at that moment, a carrier becomes a chain of explosions. Bulkheads fail, firefighting lines are cut. Control rooms fill with smoke. You do not need a dozen perfect hits. You need a few hits at the worst possible time. That is what the Americans delivered. The ocean, however, does not pause for a clean ending. One Japanese carrier still fights, Hiryu. Her air group is skilled, angry, and still coordinated. Hiryu launches a counter-strike fast. The first wave finds Yorktown. Dive bombers plunge through flak and plant bombs along the flight deck and island. Yorktown shudders. Fires start. Power dies. For a moment, it looks like she is finished. But U.S. damage control teams go to work with speed and discipline that will be studied for years. Fires are contained. Steam is restored. Within an hour, Yorktown is moving again, smoking but alive. Hiryu is not done. A second wave takes off. Torpedo planes this time. They come in low from different bearings to split the defense. Yorktown's fighters and guns knock some down, but not all. Torpedoes hit. The carrier loses way. This time, the damage is mortal. The ship lists. Power fails again. Yorktown will not return to the fight. Tugs will later try to save her. A submarine will finish her off the next day. But in this hour, what matters is what her stubborn survival has bought. Think of the day as a heavy door, slowly closing. Hiryu's 2 counter-strikes spend precious pilots and planes against one target, Yorktown, while Enterprise and Hornet remain out of reach. Yorktown soaks up the punishment and keeps the other American decks free to act. Every minute she stays afloat is a minute when scouts can find Hiryu's position and a fresh American strike can form and launch. Courage is not only flying into flak. Sometimes it is keeping a wounded ship alive long enough for others to land the deciding blow. Now step back and look at the whole chain. Torpedo squadrons attack with no hits and terrible losses, but they drag the enemy's fighters down and force the carriers into hard, defensive patterns. Dive bombers arrive at the exact window when those carriers have fueled and armed planes and cannot take a punch. 3 decks are set on fire in minutes. The last carrier strikes back with skill and damages Yorktown, but the American formation bends without breaking. The path to the final act is open. What happened in these minutes was not luck alone, and not heroism alone. It was a sequence, intelligence that placed the American carriers in the right patch of ocean, commanders who trusted that intelligence and took risks, torpedo pilots who flew into gunfire to pull fighters out of the high sky, a leader who followed a single wake across empty water, and dive bomber sections that turned training into precision at the one moment that mattered. If any link in that chain fails, the picture changes. With all of them together, the picture is Midway. As the sun climbs toward afternoon, smoke from 3 dying carriers hangs in a gray wall. Hiryu stands alone, the last sword of the Japanese striking force. Somewhere beyond the horizon, American search planes are turning home, their crews already reliving steep dives in their minds. On Yorktown, sailors struggle with hoses and shoring timbers. On Enterprise and Hornet, new strike groups are forming on deck. Engines cough and settle into a steady growl. Pilots check maps, set fuses, and fix heading. There is one more blow to land. The ocean is gray and smoking. 3 carriers are dying on the horizon. 1 remains, a knife still in its sheath. Here's the question for this final act. With 1 deck left and a corps of skilled pilots still alive, can Japan claw anything back, or is the war's momentum already gone? The answer unfolds in the next hours, when every minute counts and every choice carries a cost. Hiryu is the last sword. Her flight decks are clear enough to launch, her air group still organized, her officers steady. She has already struck Yorktown once, then again, turning that American carrier into a wounded but stubborn survivor. Now the Americans move to end it. Enterprise and Yorktown's dive bombers fan out in the afternoon light, riding guidance and hunch in equal measure. They find Hiryu near the edge of the battle space, turning into the wind to recover planes. That turn, so routine in carrier life, fixes her path for a few fatal moments. The first SBDs roll over. Steep dives cut the sky into white lines. Bombs fall through the heat shimmer, then punch through deck and hangar. Fires bloom inside the ship, fed by gasoline and armed aircraft. Hiryu staggers under the blasts. Crewmen fight to stop the spread. Hoses uncoiled, foam sprayed, compartments sealed. But fire loves air and narrow passages. It jumps bulkheads and crawls where eyes can't see. By evening, it is clear. Hiryu cannot be saved. In the night, Japanese destroyers take off survivors and send their last carrier to the bottom. By dawn on June 5th, all 4 Japanese carriers of the Midway strike force are gone. The battle does not simply end there. War rarely gives clean curtains. What follows is the long tail, days when smaller choices still break lives and shape headlines. To the west, 2 Japanese heavy cruisers, Mogami and Mikuma, maneuver hard in the darkness to avoid an American submarine. In the confusion, they collide, steel into steel, speed into mass. At first light, damage control parties labor to keep both ships moving. American scouts report the crippled formation. On June 6th, U.S. dive bombers find them. Bombs tear into Mikuma. She burns fiercely and sinks. Mogami, broken and bleeding, limps away, never the same ship again. Around the American task force, another danger creeps in from below. The Japanese submarine I-168 slips through the destroyer screen with patience and nerve. Yorktown is under tow, listing but alive, while the destroyer Hammond lies alongside, feeding pumps and power. Torpedoes flash from the dark. Hammond takes a mortal hit, breaks, and goes down fast. A violent underwater explosion from her depth charges kills swimmers and rescuers in the water. Yorktown shudders under her own torpedo blows. Teams fight to save her through another night, but the wounds are too deep. On June 7th, the carrier rolls, pauses, and slides beneath the waves. The victory at Midway stands, but the price is written on the sea. When historians tally the fight, the totals look stark. Japan loses 4 fleet carriers and a heavy cruiser, along with many of its best pilots and deck crews. The United States loses Yorktown and Hammond and dozens of aircraft. The numbers are important, but they are not the whole truth. A carrier is more than steel. It is a trained team that takes years to build. At Midway, Japan loses the irreplaceable, the veteran air groups that made its carriers so deadly. The U.S. loses ships and brave men, but keeps the learning curve and the factories still climbing. So why exactly was Japan stunned? Because the script flipped before they knew it had changed. American codebreakers quietly nailed the target and timing. AF was Midway, and Admiral Nimitz believed them. That meant the U.S. carriers were not wandering hunters, they were waiting predators. On the day of battle, the torpedo squadron's fatal courage dragged the enemy's fighters down and forced the carriers into tight, defensive turns. Japanese decks were crowded with fueled and armed aircraft, the most dangerous moment for any flat top. And then, in a small window around 10:20 a.m., the dive bombers arrived. A handful of well-placed bombs became chains of explosions. 3 carriers were undone in 5 minutes. The 4th tried to strike back and did, but she did it alone, against a foe that still had 2 decks launching. There is another layer to the shock. Japan entered Midway with confidence in its doctrine and its air crews. Strike first, strike hard, finish the job. But confidence hides a slow problem. Trained aviators are hard to replace. After Midway, Japan's bench thins dramatically. Meanwhile, America's industrial and training machine is just starting to surge. New carriers are sliding down ways. New pilots are cycling through schools. Midway doesn't win the war in a single stroke. It hands the initiative to a country built to use it. If you strip away the maps and the numbers, Midway's legacy is human. In a basement in Pearl Harbor, codebreakers chased patterns through fragments and guesswork and got them right. On the bridge of a carrier, admirals kept their nerve and fought the plan, not their fear. In the air, torpedo crews flew straight into gunfire so others would have a chance. A dive bomber leader followed a lone destroyer's wake across empty ocean and found the target with minutes to spare. On damaged decks, sailors held hoses in smoke so their ship might live long enough to matter. These are the quiet hinges on which history turns. And this is the turn. After Midway, the Pacific War changes direction. The United States does not have to chase battles anymore. It can choose them. 2 months later, Marines land on Guadalcanal. A patch of jungle and a rough airstrip become the center of a grinding air-sea struggle where every night is a knife fight and every day is a race to launch. Midway makes that possible. It buys the time and space for the next campaign, where attrition, not surprise, will decide the pace of defeat. We end with this thought. Midway is often called a miracle. In truth, it is the sum of decisions made by people under pressure. Intelligence placed ships in the right patch of ocean. Leadership trusted that intelligence. Sacrifice created the opening. Skill and nerve cashed it in. If you want a single picture to hold, see those 5 minutes when 3 carriers burn, and then widen the frame to include the days before and after. The basement rooms, the ready rooms, the engine rooms, the deck plates slick with fuel and salt water.